Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Today I want to give you a quick introduction into the Azure DevOps Remote MCP. So the plan for today is I'll give you an overview of the Remote MCP versus the local MCP, and then we spend most of our time in the demo. If you're interested in the slides or the couple samples I have, you can scan the QR code, or you also find the link in the description down below. So the Remote MCP server for Azure DevOps allows us to use GitHub Copilot to ask questions about our Azure DevOps server. This means we can ask about work items. For example, what work items are assigned to me, what work items have been finished this sprint, everything you need. Then the most useful tool in my opinion is the Wiki. So you can ask it questions and tell it to check the Wiki. Later in the demo, I will show you how we can ask GitHub Copilot to tell us how the onboarding for the project works. And it will look up in the wiki what is documented there and give me wiki introductions. So I don't have to go through the entire wiki. Then I can also ask questions about the code. This is not really a code review tool, but you can ask, for example, in what repository is this piece of code, or like how to handle the code. Then also about pipelines. For example, I'm going to show you, we're going to find a pipeline that sets up an AKS cluster. This makes it easier to find what you're looking for. And then you also have features about the test plans and the search. What's important is about the Remote MCP server is that it runs on Azure DevOps. You don't have to activate anything, you don't have to install anything. It is already there. What's also important is that the tool is currently in preview. I had one problem with it, which I'm going to mention later, but overall it has been quite easy to set up and it has been working quite well. Another thing that's great is that you can use, or you have to use, Entra ID authentication. This means the same user that's logged in into GitHub Copilot is the user that has access to my Azure DevOps organization, so I don't have to handle with secrets, passwords, or access tokens. What's also important is that the CLI, the GitHub Copilot CLI, only has access to what my users access. So for example, if there are 10 projects on the Azure DevOps server and I only have access to 5, then I can only see this 5 and get information about this 5. So it's not any different tool that extends my reach. It just uses my permission and it gives me what I would be able to find in the UI anyways. Currently, Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code are both supported. I didn't get Visual Studio to work, but I also never use Visual Studio for AI stuff, so I usually use Visual Studio Code. That's also what we're going to use today, and it will take around 1 minute to set it up. Super easy. Here we have a comparison between the Remote MCP server and the local MCP server. The biggest differences is the local MCP server is the older offering that you install locally on your machine. This means you need Node.js, you need npx, and then you can use an Azure Personal Access Token or Entra ID to access the MCP server. With the Remote MCP server, you don't have to install anything. You just use Entra ID, and all you have to configure is an mcp.json file, which we're going to take a look at the demo. What I said before, it's in public preview, so there might be some things not working. Maybe there's also something changing, but overall I had quite a good experience with it. And with this, now let's switch over to Visual Studio Code and let's set up our Remote MCP server. All right, here in Visual Studio Code, I've already opened a project I checked out from my Azure DevOps server. This is the same project or repository you can find on GitHub with all the code for my demos. So you can see everything is there. It's a lot of information, so it's the perfect testing tool for the MCP server. In Visual Studio Code, we have to create a folder with the name .vscode if it's not there yet. Then we switch inside this folder. It's the wrong one. And inside this folder, we are going to create the mcp.json file. So this year's build, Microsoft announced that a lot of Linux tools are now also available on Windows. So you can use like grep and touch. That's why I'm able to use touch on my Windows machine. And now you can see we have our VS Code folder, and inside this folder, we have the MCP JSON file. Now I'm going to copy the configuration of my MCP server for Azure DevOps. So what you can see here, the URL is mcp.dev.azure.com/your organization name. And under the header, you can configure the capabilities. So in this case, I tell it is allowed to work with repos, wiki, the work items, and the pipelines. Also, I tell it that it's read-only. The reason why I set it to read-only is I had a problem with my wiki. For example, I asked it how does the onboarding work, and it created a new wiki page with the name onboarding that was empty, and it told me there's no information about onboarding. Once I set this to read-only, it actually looked up the onboarding information and gave me the right information. So this is just one of the quirks of the preview. Then we're going to save this file, and that's already everything you have to configure for your MCP server. Then you can see on the right side, I have my chat window for the Copilot, GitHub Copilot. I also have the reference to the MCP JSON file, and now I can ask questions. For example, I can ask to list all the projects in my Azure DevOps organization. I think there are around 8 projects, but we will see. And what's also important is if the Copilot CLI tries to use like PowerShell, and here we can also see I have to authenticate. So I have to enter my username. Then the authenticator, and now it should be signed in a second. And then also we allow it in this session. What I was saying before is if it tries to use PowerShell to access your Azure DevOps server, this is an indication that something went wrong. Because it has this MCP connection, it can just connect to the server. It doesn't need PowerShell or any workarounds. And here you can see I actually have 7 work items. These are just test projects, not work items. And you can also see some basic information, like when were the projects the last time updated and what is the visibility of the projects. We can also see on the bottom right, I'm using Cloud Sonnet 4.6, so it's one of the cheap models, and I used 6 credits for this. So that's 6 cents this query just cost. But now that we have this information, let's go a bit more into it. For example, if you are a new developer or if you're a product owner, you want to get some information without clicking through the entire Azure DevOps server. So we can ask, for example, which of these projects have a wiki? Now it should check all the 7 projects and then tell me which of them have something in their wiki. I think it's 2 or 3. But we'll see in a second. And there I can see I have 3 projects that have a wiki and 4 projects that don't. And now we can ask it if there's a wiki entry about the onboarding. Like, let's say I'm a new developer, I want to get onboarded as quickly as possible, so I don't want to spend a day just going through documentation. I ask it, how do I do the onboarding? And if it finds it, it should tell me and I can get started right away. So here it gives me some information. So it tells me what website is, what the URL is, in what project it is. And it also could give me even more information. And I also can ask information about this now. Then now what I want to change, or also what we can see here is it says it ran search_wiki. This is because we allowed here the wiki functionality. So now if we take out the pipelines and we ask something about the pipelines, so what pipeline is used to set up an AKS cluster in the YouTube project, then it will not be able to find any information about this because it's not able to use the pipeline toolset. It took a bit, but we can see here in the output, the pipeline tools aren't surfacing through the search because it's not allowed, or it didn't configure the pipeline tools. What it's trying now is to look into the wiki. Maybe it's documented there, but we want to skip this for now. And I add the pipelines back. I'm also going to stop this. And now let's just ask the same question again. What pipeline is used to set up an AKS cluster in the YouTube project? And since it has this toolset for pipelines now, it is able to go through the pipelines, and then it will tell me what pipeline I'm looking for. Here you can see it's running the pipelines underscore definition. So it found a candidate that's in the folder infrastructure to app. It's called production ready gateway API pipeline part 19. So this was of my AKS gateway API series, part 19, where I set up a pipeline with an AKS cluster. So I know that's the right file. And right now it's trying to look into the pipeline and figure out what's going on inside this pipeline. Usually you would probably also just allow all these queries, so you don't have to hit the allow button all the time. Since it found the pipeline, it's now checking in the repository because all the YAML files are behind the scenes in the Git repository. So it should read the file, and I guess now it's explaining it to me. And here it tells me everything the pipeline does. So it creates a resource group, AKS cluster, permissions, some DNS stuff. I have Envoy Gateway API. So the pipeline itself has, I think, 500 lines of code. And here I have a nice overview. And if this is what I'm interested in, I can just open the file and I don't have to look around. Lastly, what's more interesting is if you're a product owner, you're more interested in work items probably. So let's give me the work items that have been finished last. So I can run this in the morning so I can see what my developers finished yesterday, for example. I could also say, give me all the work items that have been finished in the last sprint, since this has also this context. And this makes it very easy for me to see what is going on, especially if I have multiple projects I'm managing. So right now it's querying all my work items. It's probably sorting by the state that it's done and the date, and it should give us the result in a couple seconds. Also, if you're interested in what it's doing exactly, you can also take a look at all the statements so you can see exactly what's going on. And here you can see the last 3 work items have been about cube color, the AKS carpenter, and the third manager with multi-DNS. Last changed around mid of June, at the end of May, and the beginning of May. So these are the last three videos I published, and I have a work item for each video, so I know that this is correct. And it also tells me that all work items are assigned to me, which also makes sense since I'm working alone. All right, so this is already everything I want to show you today. Maybe one last thing, you can remove this line with the tool set, and now it has access to all the tools. This is probably the easiest configuration. I just want to show you this so you know about the capabilities. One last thing I want to show you is, let's switch over to the browser, to the Azure DevOps server, and I'll show you that's actually true what it told us. Here in the browser, we have my Azure DevOps organization, and we can see I have here the 7 projects it identified, so that's correct. If you open the presentation one and click on Wiki, we can also see we have here our Wiki items, and we have here the onboarding workflow. So this is just some AI generated document, but this is what our CLI found and gave us information about it. So I didn't have to go through all the documents we have here. If you now take a look at the pipeline in my other project, then we can see I have here a whole bunch of pipelines. So that's from all my demos. So it's probably around 20, if not more pipelines. And especially as a new developer, it's going to be a massive pain to look through all of them. But the AI told us that the EKS cluster is created in part 19 in the infrastructure setup. So I already know it's this pipeline. I can see when it ran, and I can just click on edit, and then I can see my entire pipeline. And if you scroll all the way down, it has almost 360 lines of code, and it gave me a nice overview. So already I have an introduction in what is going on. All right, so today we have seen that the remote MCP server for Azure DevOps, it takes around 1 minute to set up. In Visual Studio Code, all you need is to add the VS Code folder, and inside this folder, the mcp.json file. Inside this file, you just configure the name of your organization and optionally add the tool sets. Once you've done this, you can use the GitHub Copilot CLI to access your Azure DevOps server. What you also have seen is if you're not logged in, it will ask you to log in the first time. This means that the CLI has the same permission as your user to keep it entirely safe. We're using Entra ID. We don't have a password or a personal access token. Again, increasing the security and also making the management way easier. And from then on, we can just ask in natural language some information. For example, what projects do we have? What is in the wiki? How do the pipelines work? And it's great for developers to get started. And I think also for product owner to just have an overview of what is going on, especially if they have multiple projects to manage. What's important is that the feature is in preview right now. As you have seen, overall, it works quite well. Here and there, a couple quirks, but overall, it's a great tool. I barely do any AI videos, but since this is so easy to use, I thought it might be useful for you. So let me know in the comments if you want to see more videos of this. Like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't like it, and tell me what you want to see in the future. And I hope to see you next time with another video.